Let's kick some things off with intros. My name is Melissa. I work here at Prevalent in Business Development. And today we have a returning guest, Dave Shackleford of Voodoo Security and SANS Senior Instructor. Welcome back, Dave.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And last but not least, we have Scott Lang, and Scott is our VP of Product Marketing, and he'll dive into how we may be able to help mature your TPRM program at the end of this session. So hello, Scott.
Hello, Melissa.
A little bit of housekeeping here. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll get this and the slideshow shortly after the webinar. Lastly, you're all muted, so just use that Q&A box for those questions. Feel free to ask them anonymously if that's better for you during the webinar. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dave as he shares his insights on the most important steps to prepare your third-party cybersecurity program in 2024. So go ahead, Dave.
Awesome. Hey, thanks everybody for joining today. I love these beginning of the year webinars, right? I mean, we're all so fresh, hopefully, coming out of the holiday season, and things are just starting to ramp back up. Usually there aren't too many fires to put out, and so it allows you to have a little bit of clarity of thought, right? In terms of, okay, what went right last year? What went wrong last year? What was a dumpster fire last year? And what do we think is probably going to happen this year? And so I'm not much of one for just sort of wild speculative predictions. I like my predictions to be much more grounded in reality and trending than, let me just pontificate, right? That's not what I'm about. With this particular topic, there's no need for speculative pontification whatsoever, my friends, because we've seen a lot over the course of the past several years, lots of definitive trends, lots of things that have changed, lots of shifting attitudes, lots of concerns, some significant breaches, you name it, we've seen it. And so what we're going to see is, you don't always want to say, oh, well, it's just more of the same, go back to the, to the same old, same old. That's not true. We have to evolve. And so if there's anything that I'd like to talk about here in some of the discussion today, it's a bit more of the evolutionary side, right? We have to evolve our programs. We have to change some of the things that we've been doing or not doing, for that matter, and start thinking more seriously about how to get a grip or a grasp on third-party cybersecurity, because it's not going anywhere. It's only growing. And then the ecosystem of sort of interrelationships between entities and partners and organizations and customers is just getting bigger and bigger and frankly more complicated. And so waiting does us absolutely no good. So let's jump right into it. Looking forward in 2024, I think it's always a good time to discuss managing third-party risk. I don't think there's a bad time for that. But I think now's a great time to look ahead for the year. And especially when you're formulating the projects for your teams, when you're starting to talk about platforms or solutions that might augment or significantly enhance your security programs and the efficacy of those programs, trying to get a handle on reporting both laterally and, sort of upwards and downwards in sort of the scheme of things, all of that matters. Interestingly enough, coming into this, I found myself, little background on Dave, right? So I try desperately, I fail sometimes, but I try to sort of take the second half of December and do like a big winding down, right? Just kind of cleaning up all the things that are left open, the loose threads, if you will, those kinds of things, and try to, get a little me time in there. And I did get some, but this past year was sort of like a race to the finish with scissors in the dark, right? It really felt that way right up until the cusp of sort of the holiday season, where everybody magically vanished off into the ether. And it was kind of interesting as to why. What I found was that there were a lot of organizations that really wanted to have things like tabletop exercises right before everybody left. This is not necessarily something I see all the time, but all of them, every single one of them, had major thematic elements that involved third-party risk. And so it was a kind of really interesting end to 2023, sitting with lots of executives and different stakeholders and having some of these conversations. And what that led me to think about kind of heading here into 2024 is, I think this is more top of mind than it ever has been. So I'm pretty bullish here, right? So I guess it's the positivity coming out here. I think we've got a really great opportunity because everyone's aware that this is something that they need to pay attention to. Everybody's looking at this as something that is a known challenge, and it's almost sort of like unilaterally a challenge across the organizations out there. It's not something specific to healthcare or finance or manufacturing or the utility sector. It's everyone. We've all got this problem because nobody goes it alone, right? It's interesting. People think, hey, what, if I said to you, hey, if you had to name a vertical or an industry that's likely the most security focused, I mean, and this is just, I'm not quizzing everybody here, right? But if you said, okay, let's just think logically. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, financial sector's got to think about this stuff. And that's fair, right? I mean, it's the money, payment systems, those kinds of things. But it's, you think about things like defense organizations. One of the organizations I did a tabletop with, no naming names here, obviously, but it was a very large defense contractor. And so, I won't bore everybody with my background, but I spent some time in a defense contractor organization. I mean, like 2 decades ago. It's a pretty long time ago. And I was absolutely blown away by the third party alignment and involvement within that tabletop exercise. And candidly, just the sheer number of third parties and partners that this defense organization had. And I shouldn't have been, right? I mean, looking back, I probably should have expected these kinds of things. But I guess I always think of like, defense organization, right? Like defense contractor working with military organizations, dealing with, national secrets, that kind of stuff, that they would have, a pretty tight focus on things. And they do. But the third party factor was just, wow, mind blowing. They have, I think it was, over like 1,500 vendors that they work with, like that are known like all the time vendors. And they had more than that too, that they, so yeah, we're still trying to corral some of these. And it was really an interesting conversation because it just shows you the sprawl of this stuff, right? We have so many third-party organizations. And I mean, as soon as I started hearing some of this, I didn't look at anybody in the room and say, well, so can we name those and talk about the, third-party risk assessment for all of them? Because they would have laughed me out of the room, right? So the factor of just the sprawl, I think, can't be understated. Or overstated rather. Lots of weird compliance stuff that's starting to come up. Some of it, sort of still in development. Some of it pretty readily available. What does this mean for us? How do we go about getting third-party information? How much do we need to report of that? How does that align with, things like insurance coverage? Who do we report to compliance-wise, regulation-wise? There's question marks all over the place. Auditors don't know. Financial organizations don't know, or the accounting teams don't know, and especially with the require for disclosure with things like the SEC. If you're a publicly traded company, you've got very specific requirements now in place to perform this reporting, and that complicates it. It really does. The third party factor complicates it in terms of who to notify, when to notify. We don't want to go down that road completely here, right? I think that's something that I'm sure a number of you are probably wrangling yourselves and having those conversations. What's a material impact? How do you define material and materiality with regards to that? That's a big question mark for some. What are the requirements to report depending on those outcomes? I don't know. What if it's a partner? How do you start looking at things through a different lens? But some of the things that haven't changed, limited operational capacity, limited risk assessment capacity, especially if you're a large organization, and it's tough, right? This is not an easy problem to solve. And I would never get up in front of you and claim that it was. I think we can all agree that this is not a simple challenge to take on, but it's one we have to take on. There it is. There's the reality of things. And so looking at a great report, by the way, from the folks at Prevalent, their 2023 third-party risk management study. I mean, this is their bread and butter. This is what they focus on all the time. So it's always good to listen to, organizations that have that, sort of pulse on how organizations are wrangling this stuff. And 41% of companies that they talked to reported a third-party breach. So we are going to talk a little bit about breach scenarios and some of the different aspects of this. And, 71% consider this to be one of their top concerns. Now, I'll be honest there. I mean, who's the 29% that didn't see that as a top concern? I don't know. Believe me, that's a good question to ask. But 41% reporting one, okay. I mean, that's almost half. I mean, that's a lot of organizations that are out there, and there's a lot of confusion in the space. And I think there's, like I said, never a better time than now to start developing, implementing more cohesive, more informed plans that help us try to get a handle on this. And it's not as though, most of us are going to get to the end of the year and say, "Whip, we solved this." I don't think that's realistic. In fact, I don't know that this is something that is wholly solvable because it's going to morph. And sadly, one of the reasons for that is you don't inherently have control over these third parties. They have their own policies, they have their own controls, they have their own standards and processes, and so on. So you've sort of got this. I don't want to say ambiguity that comes into the mix, but you've got to take people's word for things where you might not feel as comfortable as you'd like to doing so. And we're all in this together. And what you really have to hope is that everybody looks around at the third party ecosystem that they're aligned with and involved in. And we all kind of nod together and say, all right, this is quite frankly, it's a community problem. It's not just me. It's not just you. It's all of us. So let's talk about some of these types of incidents that not only did we see last year, but we're just going to see again this year. And this is probably not going to be a big shocker, but, service failures, software failures and software breaches. Sadly, the attackers are going into the supply chain more and more so, and the software supply chain is a big factor. We're going to touch on that here in just a minute. And I think we're going to continue to see that. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised if we see software manufacturers experiencing issues. Now, whether those issues ultimately transcend to the customers, or whether it's just a matter of, we can't trust this thing for a minute, let's not do that update. Okay, there's a lot of scenarios that could play out, a lot of use cases that we could derive out of what we've seen and probably expect to see. Some of the service failures, I always used to sort of joke. It's a bad joke, incidentally. It's not really a funny joke at all, but it's like, look, if Microsoft 365 has a failure, I'm not talking about an attack. I'm just talking about a service failure. How many of us are dead in the water for at least a period of time? And I've done a lot of work with business continuity and disaster recovery scenarios. And it's a good question to ask. What do we do, right? What are the workarounds? How do we accommodate for that? What's the likelihood of those types of service failures occurring with vendor X or service provider Y? And again, those are things that we've consistently seen. So it's an incident, whether it's an incident that's related to a cyber attack or not, it's an incident. Privileges and the use of privileges and the desperate quest for privileges by attackers, particularly through account-based attacks, big problem for us. And so we've always known that privileged user management is a concern, right? We really need to make sure we know who has privileges, where those accounts are, how those accounts are being protected, and so on and so on. But especially when you get into the things like cloud-based scenarios, and you've got one-off services that don't necessarily have like central account federation, and you got to go set up separate accounts and things. There's just so many ways that can sprawl and kind of get away from you, and the attackers know it. And so that's a very easy way for them to get in. In fact, a lot of these attacks that we hear about, and we're not going to talk about too many of them here. In fact, we've done a lot of webinars together, the Prevalent team and myself, as well as some other great presenters that really focus on that. So there's a great catalog of these things on the Prevalent site that you can go check out, talking specifically about certain breaches and certain attacks. But look at a lot of them. A lot of them, they're not that complicated. They just come down to hijacking accounts and escalating that. So that's a big problem. It's going to continue to be one for not only us, but our partners and third parties. Malware infections, sadly, that's become the norm. A week doesn't go by that we don't hear about something like a ransomware infection, whether it's us or a partner. But how many of us have either dedicated or semi-dedicated connections to service providers or vendors for support, or partners that need access to certain things? And if you have some interconnections between other providers or other organizations, and they've got a malware infection, you very well could too, especially with the nature of some of the things we've seen in recent years. And so I think, we do have to be focused on that, not only for ourselves, but for others. And a significant malware hijacking scenario, right? Something like a ransomware infection could lead to the first bullet point, right? So you could very easily find a software and or service failure resulting from something like that. Unauthorized use Well, and not just unauthorized use, but unauthorized access, right? Disclosure of data, even if it's accidental, could very well be a major factor for us. Denial of service is always going to be a problem. And then, of course, the whole just nature of breaches and incidents, not only in third parties, but fourth level partners, who are they using as third parties, right? I always sort of think of the third party ecosystem. It's easy to be, sort of myopic in the way that we look at these things for ourselves. And you do have to look at, at your house first, right? We got to defend our house first and then worry about everybody else's. But every single one of your partners has partners. And if one of those fourth parties has a problem, that could lead to your third party having a problem, and now you have a problem. And it's sort of the turtles all the way down discussion. How far does the rabbit hole go? And it's almost overwhelming to try to get there. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we're going to inherently solve that problem quickly, as I mentioned before. But I think we have to start thinking in those terms. We have to start thinking beyond just who's the sort of first tier out. It's the second tier and even beyond that could ultimately impact us as well. So let's talk. Let's get into some of the action on what's coming and what's going on in the realm of 2024. And I think this one's going to be bigger than ever. And I'm sad to say that, because the attackers have definitely wised up. I kind of think of this. I mean, how many of you have gone out to a conference or something and you've had, security vendors of all types kind of ranting at you about shifting left, right? And how many of you have gotten completely and totally sick of hearing people talk about shifting left? I get it, right? You get it. We get it. Shifting left, it means we're getting earlier in the supply chain, the pipeline, all those things, particularly with DevOps and, software, pipelines and things. But well, the attackers are doing it too. They're shifting left. They're happy to shift left. They're shifting very far left, in fact, and they're going all the way to things like the code bases and things like packages that are getting downloaded. I mean, I run into organizations even now that don't have a good method to validate and verify things like open source packages that are just getting, sort of arbitrarily downloaded and packaged up in their container builds. And it's like, okay, that sounds great, makes your life easy, but a ton of those things are malicious, and they're not getting vetted out in the ether. You've got to do some of this yourself. So I think that's a factor, and I think the attackers are certainly going to continue that trend. And what this really leads to for us is, sort of this nature of the software supply chain. There's sort of three distinct elements or pieces of this. There's the development side, right? It's I'm creating a piece of software. And for any of you that have development backgrounds or work with developers, this. I don't need to, sit here and extol it. It's code and the code base, and it's testing and it's fixing and it's all that kind of fun stuff. Okay, that is one big piece of it. But then there's distribution and packaging, and then there's also the consumption and installation. There's so many places along that software supply chain where an attacker has the opportunity, maybe, to gain a foothold or modify or manipulate that software in ways that we might not have anticipated. I mean, there's a lot of vendors out there that, don't do a great job of testing, sadly, may not have good, strong visibility into their code base and what's going on. And we've got tons of examples of this. Again, we've got some great webinars that have already been done around this, so you don't need me to sort of go through a bunch of different, examples, but we've certainly got a lot of examples of that. But where I don't think we've seen quite as much emphasis is on the latter two, which is more on the distribution and consumption sides. And distribution, I mean, what if software could be modified in transit, right? I mean, think about how much of our software gets just downloaded versus being distributed. I mean, you're not getting some USB delivered to you, or the old school days, which, by the way, I just found a bunch of these when I moved recently and I was cleaning up my office, and I was like, why am I holding on to this Windows 2003 server install CD? I mean, I don't know, I didn't keep them. I mean, there was a nostalgic moment there, but you're not getting things that way anymore, right? You're not getting it direct from the manufacturer like that. In many cases, you're downloading them, and hey, what if the website's been compromised? What if the distribution site's been manipulated in some way? You start asking these kinds of questions, and I think we have to. So everything involved in that software supply chain is sort of open, and these are good examples of just places where we've seen this. We've certainly seen a number of these different situations. And like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through any one or another, but these are known campaigns where these things happen. And you're looking at this and saying, okay, certificates were manipulated. Absolutely. Hey, it looks valid, seems to come out okay, but it wasn't. The certificate itself was actually manipulated. You don't see a whole heck of a lot of those, incidentally, but that's a great example of just how good these attackers are getting. Certificates are getting manipulated, the infrastructure is being hijacked, code repositories, binaries are being changed. In the case of the Twilio breach was a really interesting one. The SDK or the development platform was actually manipulated and changed in such a way that the attackers were able to sort of do their bidding. There's just so many places where this can all go wrong. And I look at this and go, it's just going to get worse. The attackers know this. They're smart. They're shifting left, if you want to think of it that way. But we're going to see more and more of these kinds of attacks over time. I'll use the example of MOVEit. MOVEit is, I feel like I'm piling on them in some ways. Progress Software has had a thoroughly bad last 12 to 14 months. And I'm sure everybody here is probably familiar with at least some of this. Because it's just been in the news consistently for, quite some time. I'm going back to May of last year, but they were even having some other things going on before that. It's just been going on and going on and going on. But there's 0 days that are actively being exploited in the wild. Ransomware gangs are taking advantage of this. And again, we're talking about a piece of software, and this is why I bring it into the software supply chain. Probably one of the easiest examples of something like software supply chain would be, like the classic SolarWinds or something like that. And that's always going to be a classic example. But MOVEit, why this is such an issue and why I want to bring it into the discussion around third parties versus just having a big, completely separate discussion on software supply chain is because MOVEit is invariably used to share data between organizations and entities. And so it necessarily enters the conversation for third-party risk because you very, very rarely use it wholly for internal reasons or in a vacuum. It's used to share between parties. And so organizations are using each other's MOVEit transfer, enterprise file transfer solutions, which means you can't trust any of this stuff anymore. It immediately just wedged this element of distrust into organizations all over the place. And patches have been coming out. Attackers keep abusing this stuff. And there's just a lot of factors here that demonstrates not so much that the attackers hijacked, say, the code base, right? I don't think that's inherently the big discussion here. It's the fact that it's really obvious that the team at Progress was doing almost no testing at all. They certainly weren't doing the level of stress testing needed to try to find some of these bugs before shipping their software. And it's a common problem. It's just, they unfortunately became the poster child for it over the course of the last year. And these kinds of things are going to continue to happen. And so, let's bring it back to the discussion, Mike, because it's always saying, hey, well, what do I do about it? Well, look, what you need to do, first off, you need to understand your own software supply chain. I'm not going to lecture everybody on that. You probably know it as well as I do, but I think it's best to look at these services and software that you rely upon. Again, going back to some of the tabletop exercises I just completed recently, sometimes that's not that hard. Sometimes it's almost impossible to get a complete list of this stuff, but you need to have an understanding of where, number one, you have services and software that you're using that are critical in nature, meaning if they go away, you got problems. If they crash, you got problems. If they don't function properly, you got problems. And this is a continuity discussion, right? This is a resilience conversation as much so as it is anything else. Maybe that's 20 pieces of software, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 100, but those 100 or 50 or what have you, those are absolutely the ones that you need to say, okay, two factors. What do they touch? What kinds of privileges do they have? What do they interact with internally? And number three, how well are these providers and vendors that I'm relying upon to be shipping me trustworthy pieces of software, doing their own homework and putting security controls in place? And the problem with this is that you can go and bang on the door and be like, hey, software provider X, I need to know everything about your development pipeline and all the work that you're doing. And you're not always going to get great answers or even any answers. Some organizations view this as proprietary or, like really important intellectual property, and they don't want to talk about that kind of thing. But I think we need to be talking about these kinds of things. It's rapidly becoming sort of an elephant in the room. I think you have to say, look, what are my products that are at risk, and what are the mitigation measures? Sure, as security advisors, I mean, they do count for something. It's not as though the minute an advisory comes out, everybody's already breached, and we just throw our hands up and go, let's just go home for the day. Like, it doesn't work that way. So you get the security advisories. Hopefully, you've got that piece of software, and you can take some steps to, if nothing else, like, do some investigation and monitoring and see what's going on. You should ask the vendors, and yes, I'm being a little cynical here. As I mentioned a moment ago, they don't inherently always want to talk about this stuff. And I think this is going to become bigger this year. So, we can kind of chalk this last point up to what I think is going to start emerging as a trend is a software bill of materials, or an SBOM. I am bullish on these. I hope every single one of you are as well. I think we need this. And what that means, for those of you that might not have a level of familiarity with SBOMs, is that we're asking our vendors to give us a list of the components and elements and libraries and packages that are in those pieces of software. I'm not asking for the code, right? I'm not asking for your source code or your intellectual property. But if you're using Log4j, I kind of want to know about it. I don't know. Seems rational to me. If you're using particular libraries, I mean, like OpenSSL was the gift that kept on giving for years, and it turned out we all used OpenSSL. We still do. So those kinds of libraries and packages, I feel like I at least have a right to know that they're in my house. Like it's a risky appliance that I might want to just keep my eye on. It could blow up, I don't know, right? But I want to know at least that it's got a fire hazard associated with it. And then maybe, put a little bit of additional monitoring around that. So I think SBOMs are probably going to be a bigger factor for us going forward as well. Next trend, no question whatsoever, this is going to be a big deal. It's already a big deal, but it's going to become a bigger deal. And we are right on the cusp. The timing of this webinar is great, but it's just short of what we were kind of hoping would come out in terms of, sort of finalization of the 2.0 version of NIST CSF. And some of you may rely on NIST CSF. Some of you may not. Some of you may be thinking about it. Some of you might be just like completely oblivious to it or aloof to it. But a lot of people are starting to use it, if not as a primary framework, as something that they can sort of hold up and have a conversation around. And I think, that's something that helps, if nothing else. You may not bring this up in terms of your own internalization and so forth of security controls and what have you, but I think it gives you a comparison point. I mean, we've been looking for this for years. If everybody can at least say, hey, where do we stand maturity-wise within the concept of a framework that we can, if nothing else, agree it's not bad, right? Even if it's not perfect, I don't know if there is a perfect one. It's not bad, and it encompasses the things that most of us would want to see within a security program, collectively. And then, of course, you've got all of your other compliance requirements and regulations and things like that. I don't know. I think this is giving us hope, and I think it's giving, especially organizations that aren't that mature or are really just starting to get their arms around development of a security, kind of program framework, something to work from. There's a lot of metrics there, there's a lot of measurements there, and there's also a lot of comparative points with other like organizations that gives us that capability. Back to the point, it's about to be released, right? So the new version of this is sort of on its way, and we've seen a lot of developments, and we talked about this in a dedicated webinar last year. And so there's a lot more detail in that, but some of the big things that we saw kind of emerge in the comments period and the input period is, look, there's some things that I think are going to really help us. The creation of an entirely new governing section, which is good. A lot of that is stuff that they kind of moved out of other sections and just put into its own dedicated section. But that is critically important, particularly with third-party risk, because it necessarily involves a widely disparate group of stakeholders in your organization. And we need to have that level of interaction and involvement from lots of different teams. So I think it's going to be helpful in at least framing that up. A lot more focus on legal and compliance. And some of you are kind of going, oh, gosh, legal and compliance, all the fun you can stand. they got to be involved. Maybe not in every conversation, maybe not in every incident. Maybe they're sort of the dotted line aspects of the response team and everything else. But they're huge, huge parts of just about every entity out there today. Depends on your organization, depends on your vertical, depends on a lot of factors, where you are geographically, etc. But those are things that need that level of involvement. It just can't be a bunch of in the trenches technical folks, figuring it all out. There's legal ramifications, there's compliance factors, and it all ties into risk. Speaking of risk, tons of additional work and focus on third-party risk management. And that, of course, brings us right here. There's a lot of that in there. There's a lot of new and modified control elements within CSF 2.0 that really focus explicitly on third-party risk. And this is nothing but good for us, because it helps sort of derivate some of the controls that were, I don't want to say nebulous. Nebulous is maybe not the right word, but maybe a little broader than we'd like. And it sort of pulls out the third-party factor in those so that we have a little better perspective on some of that, right? And so we can say, hey, look, here's risk management. Here's where third-party risk management differs slightly and needs a bit of additional emphasis. Lots of focus on continuous improvement and some resilience and other things. But the big things that really come into play, I think, especially in the context of this discussion, it's most certainly going to be focused on that third-party side of things. And so this is just giving you some of the breakdowns. Gaze upon this enormously colorful screenshot as much so as you would like to, but realize that you can go get all of this completely for free over on the NIST site. And it is still evolving. In fact, right before I put together all the content for this webinar, I did a gut check just to see if anything dramatic had significantly changed or if there was a big update that would necessitate a new screenshot here, but we haven't seen it yet. It's coming though. And so they've essentially guaranteed they're going to really wrap it all up. And they've done a lot of that work towards the end of last year, but they're going to really wrap it all up here probably, within the next couple of weeks. It's probably imminent. So for those of you that this matters, keep checking. For those of you that it doesn't, you should keep checking either, too. It's just because it's interesting and everybody's going to be talking about it. Go check out this. By the way, this is something that is a little bit newer that I thought was kind of useful. It allows you to take that draft of the 2.0 and sort of do some alignment across, some of the previous versions and some of the other aspects that you might already have in place. Actually, like a really cool little utility. So, if it's interesting to you, again, go check it out. But they're doing everything they can to try to sort of onboard people to a framework like this, or to help them update or upgrade their programs to get a better trajectory on it. So cool stuff. Now I'm going to throw this one last one in. And this was a little bit of a last minute addition because, as you can see here, even by the date, this was a New York Times article that just came out 2 days ago. And we've been talking about this. This is not inherently new, right? So the fact that this is a January 8th article may or may not necessarily make a difference, but it sort of set off the light bulb for me to think about this in the context of third-party risk scenarios. And I could probably spend the next hour and a half talking about this. I won't, otherwise Scott will yell at me. But the reality here is we're going to see this stuff manifesting in weird ways. No question, we're going to see this sort of like deep fake situation rearing its ugly head, both for us and our third parties. And there's so many different ways that this can happen, right? So the way I see this, there's generation of video, there's generation of images, and there's also voice manipulation. So there's some really solid capabilities out there for attackers to, call up your help desk and sound exactly like Bob from accounting. And they're doing this. And so all of a sudden you start seeing new opportunities for the attackers to step in and doing crazy things that we're just not ready for. I'm just going to call it out. I don't think I've talked to a single one of the security teams that I work with across all different organizations where they said, yeah, we got this one on lock. Like, we're ready for it. Something pops up and look, it's going to get weird. That's what I always tell people is just, hang on, because it's going to get weird. You're going to see these kinds of things coming up. You're going to see the CEO of a Fortune 500 company having, compromising position photos posted online that are completely fake. They're falsified, but in the mind of public opinion oh my gosh, what a horrible person. You're going to see political tie-ins to these things. You're going to see weird stuff. And what it does is, unfortunately, start making you ask, what the heck can I believe that's out there? It's an interesting thing to bring into the discussion. The way, just to sort of bring it back to the more practical side of this, what do you do about this? And what do you do about it with regards to your third parties? You're going to have your own challenges with this stuff. I guarantee it, it's coming. But you're going to have third parties that are trusted. You've got a partner that it's extraordinarily well known that this is your critical partner. You work together. Maybe you co-manufacture a product together, something, and they get hit with this. Reputation goes into play. Damage control comes into play. And now your collateral damage as a result of that. Are you ready for that? Right? I think this is really important to start having those discussions. There's reputational factors that are going to be ripple effects as a result of some of this weird stuff happening. And so this is just sort of my own mental quick hit checklist. Like, all right, look, you do need to be monitoring. You do need to be tracking places like social media and the reputation factors. You do need to make sure that your communications teams are tied in. You do need to train employees if they see something weird, not to use the cliche, but, see something, say something. Hey, I saw something out there. Should we be worried about this? Sure. Get in front of it. Even if it's a minor issue, better to know than not know. There are some tools that are starting to emerge for things like deep fake detection. I mean, there's a whole long, really interesting list of this kind of stuff where, like, if you look at some of the videos, there's weird smoothing of people's faces, and there's strange ways that their hands are moving, or there's strange ways that people's mouths move when they speak that just aren't natural. There are ways to start picking up on this stuff, but most people just aren't ready for it. And again, as security professionals, people that are experts in your field, you're going to be more attuned to these kinds of things than the general public. The general public's going to see it one time casually on an Instagram feed and go, oh my gosh, company X is junk. Let's go tell all our friends. This is absolutely going to start happening. Make sure you got things like real-time off. I mean, especially for those like voice fakes. People calling up and like one of your partners calls up and it sounds just like the person you've been talking to for the past year and a half. And you're like, Dave, so good to hear from you. What can I do for you today? Hey, would you mind just clicking this and checking something and telling me? So social engineering is going to be a big play here. Fascinating stuff. So just get ready, right? We're talking 2024, what's coming up. There you go. That's what's coming up. So how do we prioritize third-party risks? You need to think about what's the hard and fast versus the nice to have. I can't answer that for you. I think there's, sort of an element of due care. And look, if you've got compliance or regulator folks coming to you, or you've got your insurance carriers coming to you and they say, now we got to have this, go with that, right? Go with that as the starting point for those baselines. But we really need to decide, what are the things that we're going to draw the line on and not? How often do you need to do security reviews? So is it, too many organizations, and I'm sure some of you have seen this, you'll resemble this. You sign up with a partner or a vendor, you check them, you don't go back and do it again. It hadn't been done again. It's been 4.5 years. Others, you sort of optimistically say, we're going to do an annual review, and then you maybe do. So, okay, I'm not throwing stones, especially not in the glass house here, but I think we have to be more sort of cognizant of sort of the cadence of these types of reviews. And we also need to get a little tougher on things like remediation and arbitration. In other words, hey, if you're not, fixing this stuff, especially when it comes to, say, the software side of things, I think, we have to say, okay, look, if you can't prove that this stuff's been fixed and that you're doing more, like consistent and more in-depth testing, we're not going to do business with you anymore. Now, that depends. I mean, so I'll use MOVEit as a great example. Look, if Microsoft has a problem, how many of you can just wash your hands of Microsoft entirely tomorrow? Not a lot of you. I mean, some of you maybe, right? Okay. But not a lot of people can. Whereas somebody like a MOVEit, it's a file transfer platform. I've heard that there are others. So you may have a much lower bar to switch gears and switch vendors in those cases. And I think we need to start getting, I don't want to say playing hardball, but let's get more specific about this stuff. Use risk rankings, right? I'm not going to say a lot about this kind of stuff. I know that the team at Prevalent is going to be talking about this kind of stuff here just momentarily, and they'll have much better things and more interesting things to say than I do. But you need the wisdom of crowds. You need the reputation. You need that stuff coming in, not just from your own spidey sense tingling or not, but from qualified risk assessors that are doing this consistently and holistically in some form or fashion. We're all going to need this, right? There's organizations that are using this today to great effect. There's some that are thinking about it. There's others that aren't even on the fence on it. I think this is going to become something we have to really get better at consistently. We're going to need better governance. So this is definitely that next step. We're going to need to start aligning with people in the organization, start really thinking about how vendor reviews get initiated. What recourse do you have if there's a breach or vulnerability? Do you have contractual terms that facilitate getting money back or changing without any penalties? Those are the kinds of things that we need to start talking about. And again, how often are these kinds of things being done? This is a bigger picture thing than just the security team, right? It's security teams, it's risk teams, it's compliance teams, it's vendor management teams. It's a bunch of different parts of the organization that need to be on the same page to the best degree possible. When we start talking about third-party breach scenarios, I'll hit these, and I sort of have these aligned with some of the NIST 800-61, R2 elements or categories. You need to make sure you know what's going on. What's the exposure? What's the recovery plan? What are the next steps? If there's anything in the contract, you need to talk about that. I would say, look, the first thing though, do you know who to reach out to and who's the designated party that's going to do that reaching out to the third party if there's something that happens? You need to isolate. So this is where you say, hey, look, this is more on the technical side in many cases, but can you do this? So for instance, in something like, say like a Microsoft situation, can you do this? Can you basically say, okay, we're going to lock down everything Microsoft right now? Most organizations can, but if it's a smaller vendor or a third party or something, maybe you can. Maybe if it's somebody that's got third party access into your organization, do that. Right. So these are again the things that you need to be. You need to have a game plan. You need this. I think of this actually as the break glass. So, we got a problem. Where are they? What do we do about it? And it should be a step by step with options, right? So can we do this? Yes or no? Do it. Think of it almost as like a flow chart or a tree that helps you start doing that. Going down to the next step, remediation, as you're sort of controlling that blast radius, depends on the type of breach, but, if it's internal or software, you should try to fix it if you can. But if it's them and it's only them, in other words, you're just the consumer of something that they've got a problem on, you need to just find out, going back to really the beginning, what's involved, what kind of data is potentially involved, is there a chance for this to sort of come laterally within my organization or not? Does this unfortunately affect things like your regulatory posture or stance? Am I going to have a compliance issue as a result of this? Am I going to have my insurance dropped as a result of this? Those are all things that you need to be thinking of too. And then, of course, it's all about monitoring. And really, that's a good way to sort of come full circle and say, hey, for any third-party incident, whether it's a full-blown breach or whether just something that's affecting you and others, it's a matter of saying, what does it affect within my organization, if anything? I need to watch that closely. What kinds of remote access are involved? If they are, and again, I need to really watch and say, hey, behaviorally, do we see anything that's unusual? And then you need to go back to that threat intel and reputational tracking to say, are we seeing changes? Right. So for instance, has the reputation dropped as a result of one incident? Are we also seeing affiliated phishing emails starting to emanate from that organization's domain? Are we starting to see other illicit or reputationally shady activities that would impact the reputation one way or another? Like, those are the kinds of things that you need to keep track of sort of all the way around. So yeah, check your threat intel, evaluate third-party reputation. And I think looking inward, this is really a great goal for 2024. Know where people can get in, right? Know where they can get in. And number two, know what your critical software touches, so that if it truly does end up having a problem of some sort, you at least have an idea of what the scope of an incident might look like, and sort of how far those tendrils may have gotten into your organization as ground zero. That's really something to think about. And of course, you can look at privileged user management and behavioral monitoring and microsegmentation and all those kinds of tools. But all that aside, I don't want to take this down a very sort of technical in the weeds discussion. It's a matter of saying, where are we? Like, can we get a grasp on this? We know the root cause. It came in because vendor X's software was popped, but how did they get in? Have we seen anything unusual around this? Have we seen account abuse or account manipulation? What are the privileges? Is it is it just bad PR? Do we just have to go, oh gosh, yeah, let's let everybody know we're using this vendor or this service or this piece of software, but we seem fine at the moment. Get your communications plans in place and make sure that the containment side of things is sort of prepared ahead of time. So to wrap up, and I'm going to hand this over to Scott, I think the thing to look at is, sure, stuff we saw in 2023, we're absolutely going to see some of that coming in 2024. But we need better intelligence, and we need to make sure that we've got emphasis on this from a risk management standpoint across all levels. It's not just us; it's executives, it's the board of directors, it's regulatory bodies, it's our insurance carriers, it's all of the above. These are all going to be things that we need to be thinking about. And my guess is, if we're hanging out in 6, 8, 12 months still talking about these things, some of this is still going to resonate. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand things over to Scott.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen now. I just want to share with everybody a few slides that I think will be helpful to continue the discussion that Dave started here. With all that we learned from 2023, whether it be the data breaches and the vulnerabilities, the third-party attacks and security incidents and supply chain disruptions and all the new compliance regulation stuff came out, I think it's important to put some perspective into it all, as Dave really suggested. And let's not forget the kind of the fundamental truths that many of us, not all of us perhaps, but many of us are kind of operating under as we kind of come into 2024, maybe with a fresh budget, maybe with some new priorities and new strategic initiatives and more. To carry back to what Dave said a few moments ago about the annual prevalent third-party risk management study, there were 3 really interesting conclusions from that study that I wanted to address here on the call. First is how manual third-party risk really is, and I know you all are feeling this pain much more acutely than I am right now. So please don't think I'm talking at you. But our study said that on just about 48%, right, just under 50, half of you are still using spreadsheets as your primary method to assess third-party risks. Okay, so that includes companies of all sizes, right? Little companies, big companies, medium-sized companies, all around. That's a problem, right? And that's probably getting in the way of the long-term success. And I know you probably tried to get off the spreadsheets and you just can't because of budget reasons or business process reasons or whatever. I get it, but it's a barrier. Second big challenge we see organizations face in their third-party risk management program planning is not much activity across the entire life cycle of a third-party relationship. Our study showed that about 20%, that's it, of companies are tracking risks that are unique to every stage of that third-party vendor and supplier life cycle. And frankly, I was surprised at that number. I thought it would be even smaller. But look, I get it. We do onboarding checks, we do due diligence, we do some ongoing monitoring at the time of the contract review, and then maybe organizations without the discipline and the rigor applied to their third-party vendor and supplier relationships, maybe things get a little loose as you get going on with that relationship. So that's why that percentage is a little bit lower than what you might think. So a really manual process. Not every stage is really addressed. And in the third, you probably got a lot of people to deal with. Our study showed that in 71% of companies, it's the information security team that owns third-party risk, but 63% of those companies say that the procurement team owns the relationships. So already we have this duality in the enterprise between those who are tasked with ensuring that those third-party vendors and suppliers have the right security and data privacy controls in place if there's going to be some data sharing or some system access or whatever, and the procurement team that owns the nuts and the bolts and the contracts and the paper and the signatures and all that other stuff. How do you bridge that gap, right? So I think how manual it is, how itinerant it is across a life cycle, and how complex it is politically for you, organizationally, throughout your enterprise are three ways that organizations are managing their third-party risk programs right now, and could be better and focus areas as we get into the new year. Look, at the end of the day, what that tells me is three things to be true. Number one is you got to get better data to make better decisions. It has to be more real time. It has to be more automated. It can't be in a spreadsheet. And it has to be in a form that people throughout the enterprise who aren't in security, for example, need to consume it and operationalize it. Second, speaking of other teams, getting everybody singing from the same hymnal in the enterprise, knocking down silos between teams, maybe discarding tools that only do part of the solution and not the entire solution, so that you can accomplish the third thing. And that's what spreadsheets get in the way of. Not looking at risk across the life cycle looks at, and so many people involved in third-party risk creates a challenge for it, and that is not being able to evolve and scale your program over time. So 3 business objectives and goals that I think every third-party risk program needs to align to. And really that's what we seek to address with the prevalent third-party risk management platform. I think we're somewhat in the market in that we look at each stage in the relationship that you have with a third-party vendor or supplier uniquely. Every one of those phases has a unique challenge, a set of risks, data issues, whatever, that gets in the way of success. And we've delivered very specific capabilities at every stage of that life cycle to help you overcome those barriers, whether it would be getting good risk rate intelligence on a potential vendor or supplier to make a good decision about whether or not they're not just fit for purpose, but a fit to your risk profile. During onboarding, integrating contract lifecycle management capabilities and the ability to have everybody inform on the creation of a vendor profile. To do some automated inherent risk scoring to help you determine areas that need a much further dive on due diligence to get some specific answers about risk areas, let's say if they're a tier 1 company. Another capability that we deliver is a comprehensive questionnaire library. I think there are 600 different questionnaire templates on our platform sorted by risk domain area so that you can be very surgical about the risks you want to assess those third-party vendors and suppliers against. And every one of those multiple different types of domains that we address comes with pre-built remediation recommendations right into the system. So you can suggest those recommendations to the third-party vendor supplier, make the process smoother, simpler. But it isn't just about finding a right vendor, getting some onboarding done, some due diligence, some inherent risk rating, and then developing a strategy for maybe this one-off or once per year assessment process. Kind of tying back to some of the challenges we just talked about a few moments ago, it's all about continuously monitoring for those risks in between the assessment cycle, or getting some good intelligence that might trigger another assessment. So that's a piece of it, right? Integrating that level of intelligence, incorporating that into your assessment results so you can have a holistic view of that vendor throughout the life cycle, measuring performance and SLAs, and then finally getting a good disciplined offboarding and termination process to make sure that when that relationship ends, and they all do, it is a much more efficient process and a less risky process. What we end up delivering to organizations is a combination of people, data, and platform. That is our solution. If you choose to let us do the work of third-party risk for you, we can help you manage the life cycle of that vendor with our comprehensive managed services. We incorporate, what ends up being hundreds of thousands of individual data sources into our platform to give you good intelligence to make good decisions. And we host it all on that platform with good workflow, reporting, and management capability to help you take advantage of that relationship life cycle. I mentioned that we have lots of different risk areas that manage the platform. I won't belabor that so we can open it up for questions. But before we get to questions, it being the start of 2024, or relatively, I guess it's the 10th already, but the start of 2024, if you're looking for some resources to get started this year, we've got 3 here. I realize you can't click on the link. We will send you these resources and this deck out tomorrow with a recording of the presentation. look, if you're just trying to figure out who's who in the zoo, we've got, an industry analyst report from Gartner to help you kind of identify, who's out there. If you're ready to start a project and say, hey, you know what, I'm ready to issue an RFP and kind of define a business case and whatnot, we've got a kit to help you get started there. It has some pre-populated information in it, some key capabilities and criteria, a decision matrix that helps to score different vendors and third-party risk, just to help you get started. And then finally, if you've already got a program in place and just trying to make it better this year, we've got a set of checklists that can help measure your existing processes against what could be industry best practice processes. Especially the example I have here is an onboarding and offboarding checklist, which is quite popular. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Just the ability to tie kind of what some of the biggest trends are and what to look forward to in 2024 with maybe what we can do to help, and then a couple of resources to help you kind of get started from there. So Melissa, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you want to kind of turn on questioning, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I mean, we do have a few questions in the queue. So if you want to add one last minute, throw one in the Q&A box. I'm going to launch our last poll. You'll see that pop up on your screen. I'm wondering, are you looking at a TPRM project, in 2024? Let me know. Be honest. We really do follow up with you. So we're not just saying it for fun. And then Dave, I'm going to kind of throw it back to you. You can look through the questions. We have 3 minutes left, so you can decide which questions are going to be the most valuable to answer.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, some of these have already been answered, in text. So, there have been a few of them that have dropped off. But I mean, I think this is probably one that, both Scott and myself can chime in on. And it came in from Patrick. Thanks, Patrick, for throwing that in here. But I think it's a good question, and it's one that I hear quite often from clients and people out in the industry. It's do you risk rate the third party vendors for follow up review purposes? And I think that's sort of a subtle variation of some of the themes that we've been talking about here. It's hey, look, of course you're going to risk rate vendors. I think that's almost table stakes. You're going to try to put together some sort of risk recommendations to say, hey, look, we should keep working with this vendor. We should ask for some remediation, kind of factors from them. We trust them. They seem to be doing a great job, and on and on and on. But, do you modify risk ratings as it pertains to those follow-up scenarios and continually kind of go through those things and measure those appropriately? I think 100%. I mean, and maybe that's a Captain Obvious kind of answer, but I think risk ratings shouldn't be static. Organizations do change. There are lots of updates that are made. And I think, having some sort of fluidity with regard to that risk ranking as it pertains to sort of a temporal factor, right? The timing of doing these kinds of things is the way to do it. It's just hard if you're trying to do this all in like a spreadsheet. I'm sure you got some thoughts on that, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has to be continuous, and it has to influence decision making as well. And it kind of starts with what we talked about a minute ago about the inherent risk score, right? Getting an initial risk rate of that particular vendor based on their interaction with your protected data or systems, or their criticality to the business, whatever. That can help dictate a future assessment and monitoring strategy as to how often and at what level you want to engage with them. And in between those interactions, that's kind of the importance of having that continuous feed. Not in the spreadsheet, to your point.
Avoid spreadsheets if at all possible. I don't think we have a lot of time left, so I know we had one attendee that asked for some example KPIs and KRI measurements. I would actually say please go check out some of the free materials available for the prevalent team. Some of the things Scott just actually highlighted. I know there's some in there. I have gone and perused them myself. So that's a cop-out, but it's a good one because candidly, there's a lot of good information there. And I think the last question that came in from Sarah is, like the complexity for big organization. Yeah, absolutely. Global 1000, forget it. Yeah, I mean, you got a lot of organizations, that are huge and sprawling and have lots of, locations and other things. Obviously not being able to name names, sure. But again, I think this is probably one where I'd flip it back to the prevalent team. They work with organizations exactly like you or like that, and probably have some pretty good indicators and success stories that can be shared either in their content portal or, even directly in conversation.
And I mean, we are at the top of the hour, and we do have a KPI and KRI webinar coming up next. I don't think it's next week, but the following week. So keep an eye out for that. That was a perfect plug. Thank you, anonymous attendee who put that in there. Scott, if it was you, be honest. But I'm really appreciative of Dave's time. I'm sure, the crowd would echo that sentiment. And of course, Scott, thank you for your insight at the end. Thanks you guys for attending. And if you want to stay in that loop, sign up for our emails, add us on LinkedIn, and I'm sure I will see a handful of you in your inboxes. So talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye, guys.
Everyone.